Hi class, it's Dr. Lindner. Let's take a look, moving on with the kidneys. Let's look at the blood supply and the blood flow because understanding the flow through the kidney is really important in terms of filtering. So the blood supply, although the kidneys constitute less than 5% of the total body mass, they do receive 20 to 25% of the resting cardiac output. So there is a lot of blood kind of flowing through there. Nerve supply is primarily controlled by the sympathetics. So the sympathetics, remember, we refer to it as the thoracolumbar outflow. It's what is located between 1 and L2 region, thoracolumbar outflow, sympathetic fight or flight response. So the renal nerves primarily carry the sympathetic outflow, and they regulate blood flow through the kidneys. They're going to control the constriction, vasoconstriction, or vasodilation of blood vessels. So let's take a look at the picture on the left-hand side, and then we'll try and follow it with this flow on the right-hand side. So if you remember, we're going to have the abdominal aorta here, right? So let's pretend the abdominal aorta, this large blood vessel, is coming down, and one of the main blood vessels coming off of that is going to be the renal artery. So we'll check off that first one. So there's the renal artery. When the renal artery is bringing blood and oxygen in, you see the very first branch is going to be the segmental artery. We'll put a check there. We'll check that one off. Now, that segmental is going to come and it's going to branch in between each pyramid. Now you know where the pyramids are. It's in the medullary region. So each of these darkened sections is a renal pyramid. So you can see an interlobar artery following both sides of the pyramid. So there's the interlobar artery. Now the interlobar artery is going to come around, it's going to make an arc going around the base of each of these pyramids. That arc going around the base is called the arcuate artery. The arcuate artery makes the arc around the pyramid. Now, off of the arcuates, if we look down here at the bottom, well, we could see it also at the top, there's these arteries that radiate into the renal cortex. If it radiates into the cortex, they're called cortical radiates or cortical radiate artery. So the cortical radiate artery is these small little arteries that come off of the arcuate and radiate into the cortex. Because it radiates into the cortex, we call it the cortical radiate arteries. So far, so good. Okay. So now this cortical radiate artery, the cortical radiate is going to lead, I'm going to start this one here. It's going to lead into an afferent arteriole. So I'm going to circle it and I'm going to star it. There's the afferent arteriole. Now, when we look at the top right here, we can see that there's an afferent arteriole that's leading into this ball of capillaries, this ball of capillaries inside of this thing. This little ball of capillaries is what we call a glomerulus. It's a clump of all these blood vessels inside of this round capsule here. So the afferent artery is coming in, and then we see an efferent leaving. Here's the afferent arteriole, and there's an efferent. Afferent means bringing to, efferent is bringing away. So there's an afferent arteriole and then glomerular capillaries, which is this large clump in the capsule, this round capsule here. And then there's an efferent arteriole coming out of it. So far we have those. The afferent arteriole, this one right here, if we were to compare, this one is going to be more dilated of a blood vessel than the efferent. Efferent arteriole is a little narrower. Okay, so I draw it like this. This one's much larger in diameter, the afferent, and the efferent is much more restrictive. It's much more narrower. And the reason why that's important is because a blood vessel that's wider is going to allow blood to come in at a much faster rate. And then this thinner efferent, since it's more restricted, it kind of slows the pace at which it can leave. So if it's coming in faster than it can leave, the blood is going to be able to hang out in this glomerulus and stagnate here a little bit longer to allow for what we call glomerular filtration. Ah, that should be a term that maybe you've heard, called glomerular filtration rate. We all have a glomerular filtration rate. Maybe it's slow, maybe it's fast, but we want glomerular filtration to take place, right? We want blood to come in through this wide, dilated afferent, come into this glomerulus, and we want the efferent to be narrower so it can't leave as quick as it comes in. If the blood can't leave as quick as it comes in, then it hangs out on the glomerulus, and within this capsule, there's going to be some filtration that takes place where you can get some impurities that are pulled out and eventually brought into the rest of this nephron. The rest of this nephron. Okay. Now, around this nephron, we see a bunch of other blood vessels. We see what we call peritubular capillaries. I'll circle it here in the middle, peritubular capillaries. And then vasa recta, we see that here. So from the efferent arteriole, right here, the efferent arteriole, it's going to bring the blood circulation through the peritubular capillaries, all of this stuff going around, all of the tubes that you see here, eventually leads into the peritubular veins, right? Peritubular capillaries, peritubular veins, which brings blood into this cortical radiate vein right here, cortical radiate vein. Now it's bringing it back into this arc, but now it's blue, so it's into the arcuate vein, and we can see here, down on the bottom, we have a arcuate vein and a cortical radiate vein, right? So the cortical radiate vein leads into an arcuate vein that leads into an interlobar vein. And after the interlobar, back into the renal vein. And from the renal vein into the inferior vena cava. Okay. Now you're not expected to memorize this like this, 1, 2, 3. It does take a little bit of just following the flow of this so you can kind of see it a few times. Now, I just took a blown up picture of the renal pyramid and the cortex because I really want you to see after the segmental, right? It went from renal artery, it went from the renal artery, actually went from the abdominal aorta, right, to the renal artery, and then from the renal artery into the segmental, and then the segmental into this, which are the interlobars. And now you can see the interlobar on both sides going up, 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 going to the base of the pyramid. Now we call it the arcuate artery. And the arcuate artery has extensions radiating into the cortex. So now those arteries radiating into the cortex, we just call it the cortical radiate artery. And the cortical radiate artery is going to have a branch off of it, calling it the afferent arteriole. And the afferent arteriole is going to lead into the glomerulus. Okay. And then from the glomerulus, remember there was not only the afferent leading into it, but there's an efferent artery leading away from it. This in purple is representing a nephron. And I'll go through the different parts of a nephron. So again, from the artery, the abdominal aorta, into the renal artery, into the segmental, into the interlobar, into the arcuate arteries, into the cortical radiate. Off the cortical radiate is the infamous afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole leads into the glomerulus. There's an efferent. Remember, the afferent was the blood vessel that was very dilated, and then the efferent blood vessel was much more restricted and constricted. It's going to lead to the peritubular capillaries and peritubular veins. Peri just means around the tubules, around the veins, the venules, peritubular capillaries, peritubular veins. Now it's everything that you see here on the right side, except it's going to be on the venous return. Cortical radiate vein, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, leading into the renal vein into the inferior vena cava. Okay, from that afferent arteriole on the top, from the afferent arteriole, it's going to lead into the glomerulus. So here is an afferent arteriole leading into this glomerulus, and then we'll have a efferent, which is much more restricted here. Okay, and then let's see if I change the color here. Let me change this to, let's make this black. This is all in this capsule here. Okay, this is the renal capsule, or Bowman's, I should say, Bowman's capsule. And then this gets a little convoluted like this. And then let's change this again. Let's make this a different color. How about make this lavender? Just a few parts just that I want you to get familiar with to here. And then let's make this black again. Gets a little convoluted again. This right here is the renal pyramid right here. So this in red is the afferent arteriole. Down here is the efferent arteriole. This is Bowman's capsule. We'll call it BC, Bowman's capsule. In red, I'll put a big G in here for glomerulus. That's the glomerulus. So blood flow coming in here into the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, because the afferent is much more dilated and wider and the efferent arteriole is much more restricted, the blood gets kind of stagnated in this region of the glomerulus, and it slows down the filtering so that a lot of impurities are now pulled out, and the impurities are pulled out into this first section here. I'll call this number 1. We'll call that the proximal convoluted tubule. So we see here from afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, this right here, right there, that's the glomerular capsular space. So we have impurities that are pulled out into the space and eventually into number 1, that proximal convoluted tubule. Then after the proximal convoluted tubule, it gets into this loop, right? The purple one is the loop. That's going to be the loop of Henle. Now, if there's a proximal convoluted tubule, we'll call this number 2, the loop of Henle. If there's a proximal convoluted tubule, number 1, then there's going to be a distal convoluted tubule, number 3. So you have a proximal convoluted tubule. If it's closer to this glomerulus and that Bowman's capsule, it's proximal. If it's further away from it, it's distal. So you have a proximal convoluted tubule, a loop of Henle, and then a distal convoluted tubule. And because things are going this way, right, things are flowing in this direction, they sometimes call this the descending limb of the loop of Henle. We'll call this, let's say, A, and we'll call this B, and then we'll call this C. So A, going downward, is the descending limb of the loop of Henle. B is the actual loop. That's the loop of Henle, right? And then C, going up, is the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. So there's a descending limb and an ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Number 3 is the distal convoluted tubule. And then this right here is the collecting duct. And what leads into the collecting duct are just collecting tubules. So this is a collecting tubule that leads into the collecting duct. And there's many collecting tubules that can lead into a collecting duct. Okay, so collecting tubules are just several nephrons that empty into a single collecting duct. And then, so let's call that 3. Let's call this, the collecting tubule is 4. 4. Collecting duct is 5, right here. And then the papillary duct is 6. That would be right here. That's the papillary duct or papilla, which leads into the minor calyx here. And then the minors lead into the major calyx. The major calyx leads into the renal pelvis, and the renal pelvis leads into the ureter. Okay, and I'm going to go over this nephron a few more times in detail.